Welcome to Nightmare Unveiled. Tonight, as the rain falls and shadows stretch into the unknown, we step into the realm of the chilling and unexplained. A place where whispers echo in empty rooms, forests hide more than trees, and reality blurs into fear. Here, we delve into the depths of true stories shared by those who face the inexplicable, tales of encounters that chill the soul, moments that defy logic, and experiences that leave only questions in their wake. So, dim the lights, let the sound of the rain guide you, and prepare to be immersed in a world of true Reddit scary stories. Remember, every word you're about to hear comes from those who lived it, or claim they did. Are you ready to unveil the nightmare? Let's begin. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? The idea that someone might be watching you when you think you're alone. But what if it wasn't just a fleeting feeling? What if it were true? Tonight, we dive into the unsettling story of a man who uncovered a horrifying secret, hidden right beneath him. This is the true tale of "I found my roommate sleeping under my bed." Stay with us until the end, because the reason why he was there will leave you questioning everyone around you. It all started on what seemed like a typical night for James, a 28-year-old student sharing an apartment with his seemingly ordinary roommate, Kyle. They weren't exactly best friends, but they got along well enough, sharing rent, occasional meals, and awkward small talk. But over time, James began noticing odd things. His food seemed to vanish from the fridge faster than he remembered eating it. His bedroom door was sometimes slightly ajar, even though he was certain he had closed it. He dismissed these as forgetful moments, brushing off the unease creeping into his mind. Then one night, James was lying in bed scrolling through his phone. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of his screen. Suddenly, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a prickle on the back of his neck as if someone was there with him. He froze. Listening. Silence. But it wasn't the comfortable kind, it was the suffocating, oppressive kind that makes you feel trapped. He shook it off, convincing himself he was being paranoid, and drifted off to sleep. A few nights later, James returned home late from work. The apartment was quiet, the lights in Kyle's room turned off. As he entered his bedroom, he noticed something that made his stomach drop, a faint rustling sound, coming from beneath his bed. At first, he thought it was his cat, but then he remembered he didn't own a cat. Heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight from his bedside table. Taking a deep breath, he crouched down and shone the light under the bed. What he saw made his blood run cold. There, staring back at him with wide, panicked eyes, was Kyle. His face was pale, his hair disheveled. And he wasn't just hiding, he had a makeshift bed set up under James's mattress, complete with a pillow and blanket. "Kyle, what the hell are you doing?" James demanded, his voice shaking. Kyle crawled out slowly, his movements deliberate, almost eerie. His expression was a mix of guilt and something darker. I can explain," he stammered, avoiding eye contact. What followed was a confession that James would never forget. Kyle admitted that he had been sleeping under James's bed for months. At first, it was out of desperation. He'd lost his job, was falling behind on rent, and couldn't afford to keep his room warm. But then, it became something else. "I just liked being there," Kyle muttered, his voice trembling. "I felt safe. Like I wasn't alone. You didn't notice, so I just stayed." James felt a wave of anger, confusion, and fear all at once. Kyle's behavior wasn't just strange, it was deeply unsettling. James demanded that Kyle leave the apartment immediately, but as Kyle packed his things, he left James with one final, cryptic remark. "You never really know who people are until it's too late. What would you do if you found someone secretly living under your bed? Would you confront them, or would fear take over?" As for James, he never saw Kyle again, but the lingering paranoia never left him. Even now, years later, he finds himself double-checking every corner, every shadow, and yes, always under his bed. Imagine waking up in the dead of night to find someone staring at you from under your bed. Someone you trust. Someone you thought you knew. I wasn't trying to scare you, Ben said, his voice low. I've just been sleeping here sometimes. It's no big deal. No big deal? Derek shot back, his voice rising. Why would you be sleeping under my bed? You have your own room. Ben sighed, finally looking up. I don't like being alone at night. Sometimes it feels safer being close to someone. I didn't think you'd notice. It's not like I was doing anything weird. I just needed to be there. Derek was stunned. This wasn't just about feeling unsafe, it was a complete breach of trust. And the thought that Ben had been doing this for weeks without Derek knowing sent a chill down his spine. He didn't know what to say. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with tension. Derek finally spoke. Ben, this isn't normal. You need to stop. This can't happen again. Ben nodded, muttering a quick apology before retreating to his own room. But Derek couldn't sleep after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the streetlights outside, made his skin crawl. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, Derek confronted Ben again. He gave him an ultimatum: either they addressed this bizarre behavior together, or Ben would need to find a new place to live. Ben promised it wouldn't happen again, but the damage was already done. Trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered and hard to rebuild. For Derek, that night changed everything. Though Ben moved out a few weeks later, the memory of those wide, unblinking eyes under the bed stayed with him. What about you? How well do you know the people around you? Because sometimes, the real nightmares aren't in your dreams, they're right under your bed. Thank you for joining us on Nightmare Unveiled. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share if you're ready for more chilling tales. The Night Shift. For some, it's a quiet, peaceful time. For others, it's when the world feels just a little too still, a little too strange. Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we'll hear the true story of a night shift worker who experienced something so chilling, it made them quit their job. What happened that night? Stay until the end, you'll never look at the night shift the same way again. It started like any other night for Sarah, a nurse working the night shift at a long-term care home. She had worked there for a few years and thought she had seen it all: patients calling out in the middle of the night, strange noises echoing in the halls, even the occasional unexplained sound that could be chalked up to old building quirks. But nothing had ever truly scared her. Not until that night. Sarah's shift began at 11 p.m. She was assigned to her usual floor, caring for a mix of elderly patients and those in hospice care. The halls were quiet, dimly lit by the soft glow of emergency lights. Most of the patients were asleep, their steady breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent wing. Around 2 a.m., Sarah was sitting at the nurse's station, catching up on paperwork. Suddenly, the call bell from room 213 went off. It startled her because the patient in that room, an elderly woman named Mrs. Lillian, had passed away earlier that evening. Sarah hesitated for a moment, telling herself it was probably just a glitch in the system. Still, she couldn't ignore it. She grabbed her flashlight and walked down the dimly lit hallway to room 213. When she entered the room, it was empty, just as it should have been. The bed was neatly made, the machines turned off. But the air felt cold, colder than the rest of the building. She stepped further into the room, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. That's when she heard it, a faint, wheezing sound, almost like someone struggling to breathe. Her heart raced as she turned towards the corner of the room. The sound stopped. She quickly scanned the area with her flashlight, but there was nothing there. Just as she was about to leave, she heard another sound, a soft voice, almost a whisper. Help me!" Sarah froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the bed. She stared at the empty mattress, her mind racing. Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut behind her. She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She ran to the door, flung it open, and darted back into the hallway, her breathing ragged. She returned to the nurse's station, trying to convince herself it was all in her head. But the unease stayed with her. Later that night, she decided to check the security cameras. She rewound the footage from room 213 and froze when she saw it. At 2:10 a.m., just before she entered the room, a faint, shadowy figure appeared by the bed. It lingered for a moment before fading away. Sarah couldn't explain what she saw. She didn't want to. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that building another night. She handed in her resignation the next day. Some stories stay with us, lingering in the corners of our minds, just like shadows in a dimly lit room. For Sarah, the events of that night were enough to make her leave her job and her peace of mind behind. What would you have done in her shoes? Could you face the night shift again, knowing what she experienced? Have you ever felt like the forest was watching you? Like the rustling of leaves or the snap of a branch was something more? For one family, the forest behind their home wasn't just a place of beauty, it became the source of fear, confusion, and ultimately, their decision to leave everything behind. Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we'll uncover their chilling story. A story that begins with curiosity but ends in terror. Stay with us until the very end, you won't believe what forced them to move out. When the Johnson family moved into their dream home, they thought they'd found paradise. The house was nestled on the edge of a quiet town, surrounded by a vast, beautiful forest. It was the perfect place for their two young children, Emily and Jack, to grow up. The forest quickly became a favorite spot for the kids to explore. Every afternoon, they'd run off to play among the trees, returning with stories about secret clearings, unusual rocks, and even the occasional animal sighting. The parents, Mark and Sarah, loved how happy their kids were. But they couldn't shake the feeling that something about the forest felt different. The first strange occurrence happened about a month after they moved in. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily came running back to the house, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "There's a man in the woods," she cried. Mark and Sarah exchanged worried glances. Mark grabbed a flashlight and headed into the forest to investigate. He called out, his voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response. After a thorough search, he found nothing unusual. They chalked it up to Emily's imagination. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the family started noticing other strange things. Footprints, large, heavy ones, appeared near the tree line, even when it hadn't rained. They heard strange noises at night, whispers carried on the wind, distant laughter, and the occasional snapping of branches as if something heavy was moving just out of sight. One night, Sarah woke up to the sound of soft knocking. It wasn't coming from the front door but from the back window, the one that faced the forest. When she looked, no one was there. Just the silhouette of trees swaying in the moonlight. Things escalated when the kids began coming home with strange stories. Jack claimed he saw a woman in a white dress standing in the forest, watching him. Emily said she found small, hand-carved wooden figures near their favorite clearing, but when she showed them to her parents, the carvings disappeared. One evening, Mark decided to set up a camera facing the forest. He was determined to find an explanation. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. For hours, there was nothing but the gentle swaying of trees in the breeze. But then, just after 3 a.m., the camera captured something chilling. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, with long limbs, and moved unnaturally, jerky, almost robotic. It paused at the edge of the forest, staring directly at the camera before retreating into the darkness. Mark showed the footage to Sarah. They decided to contact the local authorities, but when the police came to investigate, they found no signs of anyone in the forest. The Johnsons were told it was probably just a prank or a trick of the light. But they knew better. The final straw came 2 weeks later. The family woke up to find strange symbols etched into the siding of their house, all facing the forest. They were deep, jagged marks that no one could explain. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, and they were coming from inside the house. The Johnsons decided they couldn't stay any longer. They packed up and moved out within days, leaving their dream home behind. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. For the Johnson family, the forest behind their home was more than just trees and shadows, it was a warning. To this day, no one knows what truly haunted those woods. But one thing's for sure, sometimes, when nature speaks, it's better to listen. Hospitals are places of healing, but they're also where life and death meet. For healthcare workers, strange and unexplainable occurrences are part of the job. But one story stands out above the rest: childlike figures appearing in the ICU when death is near. Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we'll uncover the chilling accounts of nurses and doctors who've witnessed these mysterious kids running through hospital halls during patients' final moments. What are they? And why do they appear? Stay until the end, if you can handle the truth. It all started in the ICU of a small hospital in the Midwest. For years, staff members had whispered about the little kids. These weren't children of visitors or patients. These were something else. They only appeared when a patient was about to pass away. Maria, a veteran ICU nurse, had heard the stories during her first week on the job. She brushed them off as nothing more than hospital folklore, the kind of spooky tale nurses tell during long shifts. But one night, everything changed. It was 2 a.m., the so-called witching hour. Maria was checking on a critically ill patient, Mr. Thomas, an elderly man who'd been in and out of the ICU for weeks. His condition was deteriorating rapidly. As Maria adjusted his floor, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. A small shadow darted past the doorway. She looked up, but the hallway was empty. She shrugged it off. Maybe it was just another nurse or her imagination playing tricks on her after a long shift. But a few minutes later, she heard it, a soft giggle, faint and childlike, coming from the hallway. Maria stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding. The ICU was silent, the kind of eerie quiet that made her skin crawl. She glanced down the corridor and froze. At the far end of the hall, near Mr. Thomas's room, stood a small figure. It looked like a little boy, no older than 7 or 8. He was pale, almost translucent, and he stood there, staring directly at her. Maria blinked, and in that split second, the boy was gone. She rushed back to the nurse's station and told her coworker, Lisa, what she had seen. Lisa's face went pale. "You saw one of the kids," Lisa whispered. Lisa explained that the kids had been seen in the ICU for years. They always appeared in the hours or minutes before a patient passed away. Some staff believed they were spirits, others thought they were something darker. Maria was skeptical, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She returned to Mr. Thomas's room and stayed by his side, the soft hum of the monitors filling the air. At 4:15 a.m., Mr. Thomas passed away. Over the following months, Maria heard more stories from her co-workers. One nurse described seeing a little girl in a white dress skipping down the hallway moments before a patient's death. Another claimed they'd heard soft whispers in an empty room, only to discover the patient had passed away moments earlier. Some staff even reported seeing the kids playing together in the corner of a room, giggling and whispering, but disappearing the moment anyone approached. The stories weren't just confined to Maria's hospital. Across the country, healthcare workers shared similar experiences. ICU nurses, hospice staff, and even doctors all recounted encounters with mysterious childlike figures appearing during a patient's final moments. Were these spirits of children who had passed on? Or something else entirely? No one knew for sure. But one thing was certain, their presence was always a sign that death was near. Hospitals are filled with life and death, hope and sorrow. But they're also filled with secrets, things we can't explain, things we don't fully understand. For the staff who've seen the kids in the ICU, it's a chilling reminder that the line between this world and the next is thinner than we think. What do you believe? Are these children spirits guiding souls to the other side? Or are they something far more mysterious? Have you ever picked up the phone and felt like the voice on the other end wasn't quite right? Like something about the conversation left you unsettled, like it wasn't supposed to happen? For one insurance inspector, a simple phone call turned into an experience so strange, so chilling, it's haunted them ever since. Who was the woman on the other end of the line? And why is there no trace of her existence? Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we dive into the eerie story of this strange woman on the phone. Stay with us, you won't want to miss how this ends. Tom was a seasoned insurance inspector. He'd been doing his job for years, visiting homes, assessing damage, and making sure claims were legitimate. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. One dreary Tuesday afternoon, Tom was on his way to a routine inspection at a property in a quiet, rural neighborhood. The house was old, surrounded by thick trees, and looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The claim was for roof damage caused by a recent storm, and Tom figured it would be a quick job. He parked his car in the driveway and got out, clipboard in hand. As he walked toward the front door, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The windows were dark, and the air around the house felt heavy, like it was holding a secret. Tom knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He waited a few moments, then knocked again. Still nothing. He decided to do a quick walk around to assess the roof from the outside. As he was taking photos of the damage, his phone rang. He pulled it out of his pocket and frowned at the unknown number flashing on the screen. "Hello," he answered. On the other end of the line was an elderly woman. Her voice was soft, shaky, and had a strange, almost distant quality to it. "Are you the inspector?" she asked. Tom was caught off guard. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to look at the roof damage. Are you the homeowner?" There was a pause, and then the woman said, "I'm inside." "Come in, please." Tom was puzzled. He'd knocked on the door twice, and no one had answered. But maybe the woman hadn't heard him. He made his way back to the front door and knocked again, calling out, "Ma'am, it's the inspector." "I'm coming in." The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with something else, something metallic. "Hello?" Tom called out, stepping inside. The house was eerily quiet. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung in the corners. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years. As Tom moved through the house, he noticed strange details, a family photo on the wall, but the faces were scratched out. A clock on the mantel, its hands stuck at 3:15. And then, in the kitchen, he saw it, an old rotary phone sitting on the counter. It was the kind of phone you didn't see anymore, but what caught his attention was that the receiver was off the hook, dangling by its cord. "Ma'am," he called again, his voice trembling slightly. No response. He decided to leave. Something about the house felt wrong, like it didn't want him there. Back in his car, Tom couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. He called his supervisor to report the visit and mentioned the strange phone call. "Are you sure you were at the right address?" his supervisor asked. Tom double-checked the paperwork. Yes, I'm sure. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Tom, his supervisor, said finally, that property's been abandoned for years. The last owner was an elderly woman, but she passed away over a decade ago. Tom's blood ran cold. He stared at the house through his windshield, the dark windows staring back at him. Who had called him? Some phone calls connect us to the living. Others connect us to something else. To this day, Tom doesn't know who the woman on the phone was or how she knew he was there. But one thing's for sure, some houses are better left undisturbed. Do you remember the toys you played with as a kid? The ones that brought you comfort, or maybe gave you the creeps? For one person, an old Furby, a once beloved childhood companion, became the source of an unforgettable nightmare. Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we unraveled the story of the haunting Furby. A story that starts with nostalgia and ends in terror. Stay with us, this is one tale you'll want to hear to the very end. Jessica was cleaning out her childhood home, helping her parents downsize after decades of living in the same house. The attic was full of old boxes, each one a treasure trove of forgotten memories, yearbooks, photo albums, and toys from years gone by. She was about to call it a day when she spotted a small, dusty box tucked into the far corner of the attic. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside was her old Furby, a fluffy, owl-like toy with big, blinking eyes and a mechanical voice that used to chatter endlessly. Jessica smiled, remembering how much she'd loved it as a kid, even though it had creeped her out sometimes with its random noises in the middle of the night. She decided to take the Furby home, thinking it might be a fun conversation piece or a nostalgic decoration. It had been years since she'd even thought about it. The toy's fur was a bit matted, and its eyes looked a little dull, but it still had that same strange charm. That night, Jessica placed the Furby on a shelf in her living room. She laughed to herself as she thought about all the times it used to say weird things, even when she hadn't touched it. But she wasn't prepared for what would happen next. Around 2 a.m., Jessica woke up to a faint, garbled noise. At first, she thought it was her phone or maybe the TV she'd forgotten to turn off. But as she sat up in bed, the sound became clearer. It was a voice. A mechanical, high-pitched voice saying, "Me love you." Jessica froze. She knew that voice. It was the Furby. She got out of bed and tiptoed to the living room. There it was, sitting on the shelf where she'd left it, its big eyes glowing faintly in the dark. The Furby chirped again. "Play with me." Jessica's heart pounded. She picked it up, turning it over to check the battery compartment. It was empty. No batteries. Her hands trembled as she placed the Furby back on the shelf. She tried to convince herself it was just some kind of glitch, maybe leftover power stored in the toy circuits. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the Furby became more active. It would giggle randomly, its eyes blinking even though it wasn't supposed to work. Sometimes it would say strange phrases, things Jessica didn't remember it ever saying as a kid. One night, as she was watching TV, the Furby spoke again. But this time, its voice was deeper, almost distorted. "Why did you leave me?" Jessica stared at the toy, her skin crawling. She hadn't touched it in years. How could it know? The final straw came a week later. Jessica woke up to find the Furby wasn't on the shelf where she'd left it. Instead, it was on her nightstand, staring at her with its unblinking eyes. She screamed, grabbing the toy and throwing it into a box. She drove straight to a local thrift store and donated it, hoping to never see it again. But the story doesn't end there. A month later, Jessica received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was her Furby. This time, there was a note attached. It simply read, "You can't get rid of me." Jessica never figured out who sent the package or how the Furby kept coming back. But one thing's for sure, some toys are better left in the past. Toys are meant to bring joy, but sometimes they bring something else entirely. For Jessica, her Furby wasn't just a piece of childhood nostalgia, it was a reminder that some things are better left forgotten. Some stories get passed down through families, stories of love, loss, and the occasional brush with the unexplainable. But what happens when a family experiences the same chilling event across generations? Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we uncover a tale so strange it leaves you questioning what's real. This is the story of a family, a ghostly presence, and an experience they can't fully process. Stay with us, because the ending might just leave you speechless. It all began with Sarah's grandmother. Growing up in a small, rural town, she often spoke of the lady in white who would appear at the edge of their property. The figure, always dressed in a flowing white gown, stood still, staring toward the house with an air of sorrow. Sarah's grandmother, a deeply religious woman, believed the figure was a lost soul, trapped between worlds. But no one else in the family took the story seriously. After all, they were just tales told to children, right? Years later, Sarah's mother had her own encounter. Sarah's mother was a teenager at the time, home alone one evening while her parents attended a church gathering. She was reading in the living room when a sudden chill filled the air. The room grew unnaturally cold, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Glancing toward the window, she froze. There, in the same spot Sarah's grandmother had described years before, stood the lady in white. Her features were indistinct, her form partially obscured by the darkness, but her presence was undeniable. Sarah's mother couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the figure vanished. Sarah grew up hearing these stories but never believed them. They were just family folklore, exaggerated over time. That all changed when she turned 16. One late summer evening, Sarah and her younger brother were playing in the backyard. The sun had just set, and the first stars were starting to appear. As they chased fireflies near the edge of the property, Sarah felt an odd sensation, like they were being watched. She turned toward the tree line and froze. There she was. The lady in white. Sarah's brother followed her gaze and saw her too. The figure stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if observing them. "Who is that?" her brother whispered. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. But Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, almost as if the figure was trying to communicate something. Then, just like before, she disappeared without a trace. The experience shook Sarah to her core. For days, she couldn't stop thinking about the lady in white. She spoke to her mother, who shared her own story. And together, they pieced together the generational sightings, each one eerily similar to the last. Why was this figure tied to their family? Was she a ghost? A warning? Or something else entirely? One night, Sarah's grandmother finally opened up about a long-buried family secret. Decades ago, before Sarah's grandmother was born, there had been a tragedy on the property. A young woman, a distant relative, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Some believed she'd run away, while others whispered of something more sinister. The family began to wonder, could the lady in white be this lost relative, her spirit unable to find peace? But why had she started appearing more frequently in recent years? As Sarah grew older, the sightings continued, though less often. But every member of her family who lived on the property had their own encounter at some point. The experiences were always the same, the figure at the edge of the property, staring toward the house, disappearing without a word. Generational ghost stories remind us that some connections transcend time, space, and even life itself. For Sarah's family, the lady in white remains a mystery, a lingering presence that ties their past to their present. What do you think? Is she a lost soul searching for closure? Or is she something far more mysterious? Parents trust babysitters to care for their children, to keep them safe when they're not around. But what happens when the danger isn't something the babysitter can explain or stop? Tonight, on Nightmare Unveiled, we unravel the chilling story of the crib shadow. A quiet night turns into a living nightmare when one babysitter witnesses something horrifying through a baby monitor. This is a story you won't forget. Stay with us until the very end if you dare. Emily had always loved babysitting. She enjoyed spending time with kids and appreciated the extra cash. So, when the Thompsons asked her to watch their baby, Mia, for the evening, she happily agreed. The night started off like any other. Emily fed Mia, played with her for a while, and then tucked her into her crib. The baby monitor, with its small screen and crackly audio, sat on the coffee table as Emily relaxed on the couch. Everything was peaceful. That is, until it wasn't. It was around 9 p.m. when Emily heard a faint sound through the monitor. She picked it up, her brow furrowing. The screen showed the dimly lit nursery, where Mia lay sound asleep in her crib. But something wasn't right. In the corner of the room, just beyond the crib, there was a shadow. A tall, dark figure that seemed out of place. Emily squinted, thinking it might be a trick of the light or maybe her imagination. But the longer she stared, the more certain she became there was someone or something in the room. Emily's heart raced. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mr. Thompson's number, her hands shaking. "Hi, Emily. Everything okay?" he answered cheerfully. I think she hesitated, glancing back at the monitor. The shadow hadn't moved. "I think someone's in Mia's room." There was a pause. "That's impossible," Mr. Thompson said. "The house is locked up tight. Can you check? Maybe it's just a coat or a shadow from the lamp." Emily didn't want to go upstairs, but she couldn't ignore it either. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With the baby monitor clutched in one hand, Emily slowly made her way up the stairs. Each step creaked under her weight, the sound echoing in the silent house. When she reached the nursery door, she paused. Her hand hovered over the doorknob as she listened. There was no sound, no movement. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was just as it appeared on the monitor, dimly lit by a small nightlight, with Mia sleeping peacefully in her crib. Emily scanned the room, her eyes darting to the corner where she'd seen the shadow. It was gone. Emily let out a shaky laugh, convincing herself it must have been her imagination. She checked on Mia, who was still fast asleep, and returned downstairs. But as soon as she sat down, the monitor crackled again. Her blood ran cold as the shadow reappeared. This time, it wasn't in the corner. It was standing right next to the crib. And then it moved. Emily's heart pounded as she watched the figure lean over the crib. It didn't have a face, just an outline of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Mia started to stir, letting out a soft cry. Emily didn't think, she just ran. She bolted up the stairs, flung open the nursery door, and turned on the light. The room was empty. No shadow, no figure. Just Mia, crying softly in her crib. Emily scooped Mia up, her hands trembling. She didn't stay in the room long. Grabbing her phone, she called the Thompsons again and demanded they come home immediately. When they arrived, Emily explained what had happened. Mr. Thompson searched the entire house but found nothing out of place. They tried to reassure her, suggesting it might have been a malfunction with the monitor or a trick of her imagination. But Emily knew what she saw. Sometimes, the things we see through a screen are more than just shadows.
For Emily, the crib shadow wasn't just a figment of her imagination, it was a chilling reminder that some things defy explanation. Was it a ghost? A warning? Or something far darker? The internet is full of ghost stories, but nothing hits harder than hearing them from real people who've lived through the terror. On Reddit, the world's largest collection of true horror tales exists, and tonight, we've selected the 7 scariest ghost stories shared by brave users. From haunted homes to spectral visitors, each story is more unsettling than the last. This is a journey into the unknown, a compilation you won't want to miss. Turn off the lights, settle in, and get ready for a spine-tingling ride. Let's begin. It started with footsteps. A Reddit user shared their chilling experience of hearing heavy, deliberate steps in their empty hallway late at night. When they finally gathered the courage to investigate, they found nothing except for a single muddy footprint in the middle of their pristine carpet. The footsteps didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, they began to see shadows moving just out of sight. One night, they woke to a figure standing at the foot of their bed. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching. They moved out within a month, but the memory of the shadow still haunts them. A user recounted the bittersweet yet terrifying moment when their late grandmother paid them a visit. It was 2 days after her passing, and they were sitting alone in her living room, reminiscing, when the old grandfather clock, silent for years, chimed suddenly. Looking up, they saw their grandmother's favorite rocking chair moving gently, as though someone had just stood up from it. A faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, and then, just as quickly as it began, the room fell silent again. Some believe it was her way of saying goodbye. Others? Proof that love lingers even after death. What would you do if you realized your roommate wasn't alive? One Redditor moved into an affordable apartment with a friendly roommate. Everything seemed normal until they began hearing whispers at night, even when their roommate wasn't home. Things escalated when they found an old diary hidden in the closet. The entries described someone being tormented by something in the walls. The next morning, their roommate was gone. No trace, no belongings, just gone. They later learned the previous tenant had died in the apartment years ago. Was their roommate even real? Late-night dares often lead to regrets, and one Reddit user shared their terrifying experience of visiting an abandoned cemetery at midnight. Armed with flashlights and bravado, they and their friends wandered the overgrown paths until they stumbled upon a lone gravestone, glowing faintly in the moonlight. They took photos, laughed nervously, and turned to leave only to find the path back had vanished. Panicked, they retraced their steps but kept ending up back at the glowing gravestone. Finally, after hours of wandering, they emerged from the cemetery. When they checked their photos later, every single one showed a shadowy figure standing behind them. A Redditor's grandmother gifted them an antique doll, one with glassy eyes that seemed to follow you around the room. Strange things started happening immediately, lights flickered, objects moved, and their cat refused to go near the doll. One night, they woke up to the doll sitting at the foot of their bed, even though it had been locked in a cabinet. The next day, they buried the doll in the backyard, but the disturbances continued. When they finally dug it up to burn it, the doll looked different. Its once pristine dress was now torn, and its eyes appeared cracked, almost lifelike. They still don't know where the doll came from or why it chose them. In a small, quiet home, a user began hearing faint voices coming from their attic late at night. At first, they dismissed it as the wind or the house settling. But then, the voice started calling their name. One night, they mustered the courage to check it out. Armed with a flashlight, they climbed into the attic and found an old, dusty mirror. As they shone their light on it, the voice stopped, and the mirror cracked down the middle. They threw the mirror away, but to this day, they hear faint whispers whenever they're alone in the house. A Redditor staying in an old hotel experienced a night they'll never forget. It started with an unsettling feeling, like they weren't alone.
Around 3 a.m., they woke to the sound of someone pacing in their room.
Terrified, they stayed under the covers, too afraid to move.
When they finally peeked out, they saw the figure of a man in old-fashioned clothing standing by the window. The next morning, they asked the front desk about it, only to be told the room had been unoccupied for years, ever since a guest had jumped from that very window. 7 stories, 7 chilling encounters, and 7 reminders that the world is far stranger than we know.
Which of these ghostly tales sent shivers down your spine? Let us know in the comments below. And remember, when the lights flicker, the shadows move, or you hear a whisper in the dark, you might not be alone.